Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. Happy whatever day it is. This is Left Side of the Aisle, and I'm Larry Erickson, your host. For the next half hour or so, I'm going to be talking about some things that, well, I hope you'll be interested in. I think they're worthy of note. As always, I will tell you at the top that if you have any reactions to the show, you can send them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus, Surviving a Dark Time. The URL will be over here a couple of times during the show. And you can leave a message there if you'd like, or if you missed the email, you can get that there. If you do send me email, please include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is not spam, it's about the show. And be a little patient about getting an answer because I stink at answering email. So with that, let's get to it. I always like to start whenever I can with some good news. And I didn't find a lot of good news to go around this week. But I did find this. After a long fight, over 40,000 people in Maryland just got the right to vote. In Maryland, a convicted felon loses their right to vote until their sentence is completed, including any time on parole or probation. However, last year, the Maryland legislature passed a bill that would restore voting rights upon release from prison. The idea that if you're on parole, you're supposed to be a member of society, so why can't you act as a member of society? Well, Governor Larry Hogan vetoed the bill, saying he thought the existing law made the proper balance. Last month, the House in Maryland overrode the veto, but the prospects in the state Senate weren't as bright. Last year's bill passed with the minimum number of votes necessary to override a veto, which means the supporters could not afford to lose a single vote. It was close enough that Senate President Thomas Miller actually delayed the vote last month so that a vacant seat could be filled, and delayed it again this week in order to give two senators time to attend the session. But it all was good, it all worked, because when the vote came, there were 29 votes to override. That is the minimum number necessary. Which means that about 44,000 people in Maryland can now register and vote rather than having to wait who knows how many more years. And yeah, that's good news. Just a passing thought here, by the way. The openly Marxist Hugo Chavez was president of Venezuela from 1998 to 2013. During that time, across the administrations of Clinton, Bush, and Obama, any time that there was a threat made in Venezuela to close down or suspend some opposition news outlet or media station, the U.S. government declared that this was proof that Hugo Chavez was, or at the very least trying to be, a tyrant and a dictator. Okay. On February 9th, Sute Takachi, she is the Internal Affairs and Communications Minister of Japan, told a parliamentary committee that the government can order broadcasters to suspend operations if they continue to air TV program which the government feels is politically biased. Takachi told a lower House Budget Committee that the government is legally authorized to order stations and broadcast stations to cease broadcasting if they ignore what she called official calls to remain politically neutral, a term which Takachi herself hinted could include the meaning, don't criticize the government. I wonder how long we're going to have to wait before some U.S. government official says of Japan that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is trying to become a tyrannical dictator. All right, next up. I've been wondering for some time about this, and I'm glad to see that there are some others now who are starting to raise the question. The question of when did we on the left stop talking about the military budget? When did we stop saying that the Department of Defense, the DoD budget, is too big, which it is? When do we stop calling for cuts in a bloated military establishment that both drives and enables a militaristic foreign policy? When did we stop saying things like, fund human needs, not wars? This is how bad it's gotten. This is how far off the table the issue of military spending has fallen. In 2013 and again in 2014, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which every year releases something they call the People's Budget, in those 2 years, they included a call for Pentagon spending to be cut back to 2006 levels. They projected that over a period of 10 years, this would save about $1 trillion, or roughly $100 billion a year on average. Last year, in 2015, their budget proposed a 1% cut in military spending, and you had to search the budget in order to find any mention of that. But the fact is, military spending is the elephant in the room, the economic elephant in the economic room. The U.S. Treasury, see, divides all federal spending into 3 categories: mandatory, discretionary, and debt service. The first 2 of those take up well over 90% of the entire federal budget. Mandatory spending is just that. This is spending that's set down by law. For an obvious example, Social Security spending is mandatory. Medicare spending is mandatory. Unless that law itself is changed, the government can't just say, oh, we're going to devote this much money to Social Security this year and we'll see how far that goes. Mandatory spending accounts for over half of the federal budget. Discretionary spending, on the other hand, comprises about 1/3 of the total federal budget, but this is the portion of the budget that you actually argue about every year. It's the part that decisions are made about every year. If you want to expand housing programs, if you want to push renewable energy, if you want to expand education benefits, if you want to do a whole range of things, this is the part of the budget you argue it in. And here's the thing, military spending, even with a narrow definition of it, takes up 54% of discretionary spending. No other item, not agriculture, transportation, unemployment, energy and environment, veterans benefits, education, nothing else gets more than 6%. But for some reason, we have stopped talking about cutting the military. Now, is this really because we think President Hopi Changey, and it's been a while since I called him that, do we really think that President Hopi Changey actually deserved his aspirational Nobel Peace Prize? Is it because we have been struck with political cowardice, fearing to give any criticism of Obama for fear of giving succor to the right-wing wackos? Is it because we've been stampeded by the drumbeat of ISIS, 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 until we are politically terrified of looking weak on terrorism? Or even worse, stampeded into embracing the world of perpetual war, the world where bombing runs and drone runs are so common and ordinary that they don't even get reported on anymore? I don't know. What I do know is we have to break out of that spell. Because on February 9th, the amazing Mr. O proposed a budget for the Department of Defense, which, interestingly enough, until after World War II was called the Department of War, which is a little more honest. But he proposed a budget for the Department of Defense of $582.7 billion, while asking for, by way of one comparison, 1/8 as much of that for all education benefits. His budget would increase funding for fighting ISIS, ISIS, ISIS by 50% and quadruple funds for U.S. military presence in Europe. And this, by the way, Department of Defense is not all of our military spending. Veterans Affairs, the military-related activities of the State Department, the nuclear weapons program, which is actually housed in the Department of Energy. And by the way, did you know that we still have about 5,000 nuclear weapons? All of these and more can easily add close to another $200 billion to military spending. Despite that, and despite the fact that the proposed budget is in line with last year's congressional budget deal, goppers are screeching that this is too low. And we need to spend even more on killing people and preparing to kill people, while at the same time they say we have to spend less and less on helping people stay alive. If we do not break out of this self-imposed silence, there will be no counter-narrative. There will be no counter-narrative, and a nearly $600 billion military budget, or to be more honest, a nearly $800 billion military budget, will become a floor, not a ceiling. While, for example, Amtrak will continue to die the death of 1,000 cuts. Someone proposing something like an expansion of community health centers will be told there's no money for that unless you want to steal it from some other deserving domestic program. And any who suggested something like a national jobs program for infrastructure repair would be laughed out of the halls of Congress. We have got to break that spell. We have got to get back to demanding real cuts, not smaller increases, but real cuts in military spending. Because the fact is, as long as we can find money for Humvees but not for housing, the military budget is too big. As long as we can afford high-tech drones but not high-speed trains, the military budget is too big. As long as more jets outranks more jobs, the military spending is too big. As long as we can splurge on F-35s as we skimp on food stamps, the military budget is too big. And as long as hostilities eat up more of our resources than hospitals, the military budget is too damn big and needs to be cut. All right, next up. Speaking of that, I have to go back to something I said last week because I have to give it a fuller context. I was talking about the primaries. I said probably the only time I would, but I kind of have to revisit that for a particular reason. Because last week, among the criticisms I leveled against Hillary Clinton is that she is more hawkish than people seem to realize. What I want to emphasize now is that the same is true of Bernie Sanders. He's not as hawkish as she is, it appears, but the difference between them is much less than what people seem to think. For example, he, just like she, supports the bombing in Syria. He, just like she, endorsed keeping several thousand U.S. troops in Afghanistan until at least 2018. He, just like she, supports the drone program that has killed thousands more innocent civilians than any number of, than it has, supposed terrorists. And Sanders has been every bit as sycophantic about Israel as Clinton has, and that is saying something. He actually supported Israel's 2014 invasion of the Gaza Strip, an invasion that led Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations to accuse Israel of war crimes. Now, yes, he voted against the Iraq War, and yes, he was opposed to U.S. military action in Libya, and yes, he's less hawkish than she is about Syria, but overall, it has to be said that there's not what you could call, in terms of current U.S. wars, there is not a whole lot of difference between them. In fact, here's the way they might draw a difference between them, and it's one that doesn't depend on sound bites or rehearsed slogans. The Obama administration is now drawing up plans for a new military intervention in Libya. Which makes sense, of course, because the first one, which we were told was about rescuing civilians, but actually was about getting rid of Muammar Gaddafi, went so well, what with Libya descending into the chaos of a multi-sided civil war from which it is still not emerged. Oh, but it's different this time. This time it's about opening a third front in the fight against ISIS, and taking decisive military action, quote unquote, against some groups in Libya claiming the name. This is being planned without any debate in Congress, without any remotely plausible claims of legal authority, without regard to the fact it was Barack Obama himself who said in 2007, and I'm quoting, "The president does not have the power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation." And it's being undertaken, it seems, without any consideration of how similar decisive actions recently have led only to deepening U.S. involvement in Syria and Iraq, with boots on the ground in both places, including Syria, where they were never supposed to be, we were told, playing an increasingly hands-on role. So, what could go wrong? I'm sure this will come up somewhere, sometime, somehow in the course of the primary. So in response to this, see what Clinton says, see what Sanders says, and see how much, if any, daylight you can find between them. All right, one last thing before the break. As long as we're talking about wars and rumors of wars, a little footnote to all this, just so that you might keep this in mind the next time you're thinking about the military action and places where it seems so clean and safe. On January 25th, the United States announced it was considering increasing its financial aid to help Laos clear its countryside of unexploded bombs that date back to the Indochina War, bombs that still kill about 50 Laotians a year, more than 40 years after the Indochina War ended. We're taking a break. And here we are back again. Something I meant to talk about a little bit before, and it slipped my mind. After the good news about folks in Maryland regaining their right to vote, we also have some not good news about voting issues. One is that New Hampshire's voter photo ID law has gone into effect now. But the other is that if a suit now in federal district court fails, voters in North Carolina will face a similar hurdle, a hurdle which there, as in other places, disproportionately affects the poor, the elderly, and communities of color. And North Carolina passed this law literally just weeks after the Supreme Court in 2013 ripped the heart out of the Voting Rights Act by finding that areas which had a history of discrimination no longer needed to get clearance for changes in their laws that could affect minorities. Besides the photo ID requirement, the North Carolina law also shortened things like it shortened the number of voting days before the election, early voting days. It eliminated programs to encourage voter registration, and it raised the limits on the amount of money that people could contribute to political candidates. In other words, it made it harder to register, harder to vote, and easier to buy elections. Now, in this suit, the photo ID part is what's issue. Other sections of the law are the subject of a separate suit. But the fact is that, again, if this suit fails, you know, it just seems to me it wasn't that long ago when the big issue for us as Americans was how we could get more people to vote. Now it seems how many roadblocks can we put up is the real issue. But then again, those old days, that was before the right wing caught on to the fact that the lower the voter turnout, the better it is for them. All right, with that, leave that now and we'll move on to one of our regular weekly features. This is the Outrage of the Week. Now, I actually had several candidates for Outrage of the Week this week, but this one just struck me as just being so morally offensive, so callous, actions that are just so indifferent to the consequences, to the results of their actions, that it had to be the one that I talked about. It's been known for some time that there are clear patterns of racial and socioeconomic disparities in the placement of environmentally hazardous sites, hazardous waste sites, polluting industries, and other such unhealthy and unwelcome uses are disproportionately located in depressed, non-white, and poor communities. The question has always been, are those sites there because the depressed communities are non-white or poor, or both, as they often are? Or did those communities become depressed because of the placement of a hazardous site, driving anybody who could leave to get out while the getting was good? It was considered a question like, you know, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, it turns out that just like in the case of the chicken, there is an answer. In the case of the chicken, quick science sidebar here, egg-laying creatures have existed on the earth long before chickens ever emerged, which means that chickens must have evolved from an earlier egg-laying creature. The egg came first. In the case of the communities, well, Paul Mahai at the University of Michigan and Robin Saha at the University of Montana have given us the answer. They analyzed 319 commercial hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities cited in the United States from 1966 to 1995. They also got the demographic composition of the communities at the time that the sites were actually placed, and as well as considering demographic changes that occurred in those communities after. What they found was, quoting them, a consistent pattern over a 30-year period of placing hazardous waste facilities in neighborhoods where poor people and people of color live. In other words, which came first, the waste dump or the depressed neighborhood? The answer is the neighborhood. Our captains of industry sought out neighborhoods where poor people and people of color live, sought them out as places to truck in and store their noxious waste and pollution. Why? Well, that's actually quite simple. If they tried to put this sort of crap in a more affluent community, they would meet resistance. They'd have to deal with all kinds of objections, all sorts of demands for guarantees, if not, and more likely, outright rejection. They would face delays, potentially lawsuits, all of which cost time and money, even if the corporation was ultimately win. But poor communities and minority communities, which are often both because minorities are disproportionately represented among the poor, such communities usually lack both the resources and the political connections to mount an effective resistance against a corporation waving plans and promises in front of a city government. These communities are simply, as the researchers themselves said, paths of least resistance. Which means, and this is what I want to emphasize here, the siting of these facilities in these neighborhoods is not, despite what some would have it, this is not racism. This is not classism. This is capitalism. This is what will make me the most money at the least cost. What will net me the biggest profit with the least inconvenience. And I really don't care about the impact I have on the communities where I operate, because after all, I don't live there, so why should I? The research showed that these communities, already depressed, became even more depressed, became even poorer as time went on, but I don't care because I am indifferent to the impacts that I cause. I am indifferent to the fate of these communities as long as it doesn't affect my profit. That's what this is. Not racism, not classism, but the cold-blooded logic of the marketplace, and this is the sort of result that that logic inevitably leads to. And if you don't think that's an outrage, you need to reconsider your worldview. All right, from there, it's sort of actually related in a way, because we're going to our other regular weekly feature. It's the Clown Award. And oh, we have a real one this week. Wow, a callous jerk and a brain-dead bozo in one fatuous package. So the winner of the Big Red Nose this week is Steve Schwarzman, the CEO of his own private equity firm, which is called Blackstone. Schwarzman, a billionaire and one of the world's richest men, was attending the annual gathering of corporate and government leaders in Davos, Switzerland, which I still want to call Davros. And he told Bloomberg TV that he just can't understand why American voters seem discontented. He expressed astonishment at, quoting him, the amount of anger, whether it's on the Republican side or the Democratic side, and said of Bernie Sanders in particular, how is that happening? Pew Research has found that the wealth gap between upper income and median income households in the United States is the biggest it's ever been. That between 1983 and 2013, median household net worth for middle income families went up just 2%. For lower income households, it went down by 20%, but for upper income households, it doubled. That is an inequality that is growing as wages have stagnated and healthcare costs, despite the promises of Obamacare, continue to rise. And yet Steve Schwarzman, who back in 2010 likened the prospect of a tax increase to Hitler invading Poland, yes, literally, He just can't understand. He just can't fathom what those angry people are on about. And you want to know what's really sad and really even more telling? He probably doesn't understand. He probably is that out of touch with the basic reality of life that exists beyond his insulated bubble. Steve Schwarzman, if it wasn't for the enormous power that bozos like him and buffoons like him exercise in the world, I could almost feel sorry for him. Because, my gosh, what a clown. Finally, we have an RIP this week, and these are becoming unhappily frequent. Paul Kantner, one of the giants of the San Francisco music scene, a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, died on January 28th. He was 74 and suffered a heart attack, which led to death by multiple organ failure and septic shock. Although later in his career he worked with a number of different people, he's likely best known as a founding member of Jefferson Airplane, a group that defined what in the mid-60s became known as the San Francisco Sound. The group, often known to its fans by the shortcut name Airplane, and by the way, the name of the group was Jefferson Airplane. If somebody called them the Jefferson Airplane, you knew they weren't really a fan. But Airplane was the first headliner when Bill Graham opened his now legendary Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco and played at the three most famous music festivals of the era: Monterey Pop in 1967, Woodstock in 1969, and a few months later, the tragic Altamont concert, which some folks say was Don McLean's coda to the day the music died, a long, slow death of musical innocence marked initially by the death of Buddy Holly. Originally intended to be sort of a folk rock blues kind of group, Airplane's biggest hits, such as Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, owed more to psychedelia than they did to folk. But still, when they turned out a ballad such as Today, which Kantner co-wrote with fellow band member Marty Balin, or Coming Back to Me, for example, those folk blues roots did show through. In time, of course, the band broke up, followed by several incarnations of Jefferson Starship. People moved on. Kantner became something of a landmark on the San Francisco music scene, the only member of Airplane or Starship still living there, still singing, still touring until his death failed. So, R.I.P. Paul Kantner. And as a sorrowful footnote to that, on the same day that Paul Kantner died, we also lost Signe Toly Anderson. She was a vocalist with a soulful contralto and another original member of Jefferson Airplane. She was also 74 and had been suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. Anderson left the band after the group's first album to be a stay-at-home mother because she said she could not imagine touring with a newborn. That's a decision she said back in 2011 she never regretted. So, R.I.P. Signe Toly Anderson. That's it for this week. We will see you again next week. In the meantime, you, as always, have the best week you possibly can. And as always, peace.